Hey everybody, welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast, where we're helping ODs all over the country make better and better decisions around their money, their careers, and their practices. I'm your host, Evon Mendrin, certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, a no-commission fiduciary financial planning firm just for optometrists nationwide. And on today's episode, we have another awesome guest, David Tessier with Wells Fargo Practice Finance, and he joins me to talk all about practice financing. He talks about the whole cold start process, what it looks like to get lending for a cold start, talks about practice transitions, buying into a practice. He talks about what lending looks like when real estate's involved. And he also talks about, in his experience, what has made transitions successful from a selling doctor to a buying doctor. And it was a great conversation, a lot of fun. I think there's something to learn for anyone who's either thinking about getting into practice ownership or a doctor who's wanting to sell their practice and wanting to make sure that that transition goes smoothly. So if you have any questions on today's episode, you can reach me by sending an email, Evon, E-V-O-N, at optometrywealth.com. If you've enjoyed the podcast and the content we're creating here, leave a review. It's always great to see that feedback and super helpful to know how to make this a better and better resource for you. And you can find all the resources and show notes for this episode on the Education Hub in my website, optometrywealth.com. And while you're there, you can schedule a no-commitment introduction call to learn more about how I help optometrists more proactively plan and monitor their finances. And without further ado, here is my conversation with David Tessier. And welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast. I am your host, Evon Mendrin, and I am here with another fantastic guest today. I'd love to welcome to the show David Tessier of Wells Fargo Practice Finance. David, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, I appreciate your time, and I am excited to talk all about the various forms of practice financing, because borrowing is a part of almost every optometrist's life in one form or another, whether it's student loans, whether it's a mortgage. And then for those who want to go on to some form of practice ownership, there's typically some form of financing involved. So I'm excited to talk with you all about financing from the perspective of a cold start, a brand new practice, and also from the perspective of acquiring and purchasing a practice, and other forms of borrowing related to that. And before we dive into all of that, I just want to get a little bit of a background. How did you get into lending and eventually with Wells Fargo with optometry practices and other healthcare practices too?
Absolutely. So I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of my background here, not to bore you. So I've been in healthcare lending to some degree for the last 17 years. With three different firms. I was with once upon a time, I was in medical device in between my finance career, and realized that I was better with numbers than I am with the anatomy. So I went back into finance. So I got my MBA in healthcare administration, with Wells Fargo now since 2011. I've seen all different sides of healthcare finance, from the large corporate healthcare facilities that we all know and use today, and then the smaller, 1 to 5 physician groups, which I love. This is the space that I'm in today, which is the healthcare finance group, and this is the group that I love. I love talking to the physician who is either starting a practice, right from the scratch, and they have this vision, and I love partnering with them to help that vision come to fruition. And so yeah, I've been in this field for 17 years, so I've seen a lot of different aspects of it.
Yeah, and what have you seen that's different about healthcare businesses and maybe even these smaller practices than other types of businesses in other industries? Like what have you seen about healthcare that's different from other industries?
Yeah, and it's actually one of the first things I always talk about when I'm giving a presentation. I give a lot of presentations in regards to regards to healthcare finance and how to either start, buy, acquire, refinance, real estate, all within healthcare. one of the main things that I always touch on and try really drive home is if you're working with a lender, albeit Wells Fargo or another lender, you want to make sure that that lender is healthcare specific. They're going to look at healthcare. A firm who dabbles in healthcare could maybe get a healthcare deal done, and I've seen it done time and time again. But as far as from a timing perspective and knowing all aspects on how to pivot if needed, the healthcare finance groups, like anything else, right? I mean, you go to, depending on, what type of physician you need to go to, you want to make sure that you're speaking to that specialist, right? We're just that degree of finance. We're just a specialist finance group. And the way that we underwrite, the way that we review a deal, from a cash flow perspective and from a projection perspective is a lot different than somebody who's looking at what's called CNI or just your general commercial industries type of business, right? So if somebody's looking at a yogurt shop, a yogurt chain, they're going to look at that a lot different than a healthcare deal.
Got it. That makes sense. And we're recording this in June 2022 in a sort of wild, dramatic interest rate environment. I just had a mortgage lender onto the podcast recently. We talked about how interest rates have just risen so dramatically from a mortgage perspective. And what does that look like right now from a practice lending perspective? How have the change in interest rates affected practice lending?
Yeah, well, we're not protected from the rising rate environment. Yeah. I'd love to say that we're slightly behind, your personal rates, and I say your personal rates, and I include mortgages in that. So if I'm looking at a commercial real estate deal or a practice acquisition deal, my rates are still lower than your mortgage rates, right? But we're included in all of that in a rising rate environment. But it hasn't slowed down production, as far as on our side. There has been a little bit of a pause. Some folks who are a little bit gun shy because we are going into a potential economic winter. So they're being a little bit more cautious, which I like, right? That makes me know that the doctor is, a prudent and responsible borrower. And it's my responsibility to kind of talk them through all of that. One of the things that I always talk about is that I think, over the last 3 years, we really got really spoiled when it comes to rates. Yep. Right. We were at the lowest rates I've ever seen, but today's rate is still, I don't want to say historically low, but it's on par with what rates were at, 5 years ago. Yeah. In fact, my rate 5 years ago compared to my rate today is still lower. My rate today is lower than it was 5 years ago. Flip that on the side. So rates today are still low in regards to where they were historically. So I think, it's just more of a mindset, and folks who think they missed out or that they think that rates are going to come back to where they were. That's probably going to be, I leave that up to the smart guys, to tell me where the rates are going. But as far, if I were to look, at my historic trends on what I've seen, what I've experienced, rates are still decent, right? I was in the market when I was, I had practices that were doing 15%. I had business lines, right? A working capital line that was at 23%.
Wow.
Yeah, but in regards to that, you got to look at what that 23% is going to bring you, right? That's a terrible rate. That's a long time ago. I'm kind of dating myself here. But when you look at what a line of credit is going to do for you, a business line of credit, for example, if you have a ROI on that, it's not so much the rate, right? If you have whatever your return on that asset is going to be, whether it's an equipment purchase, whether it's a line of credit that's going to for marketing, right? Or a consultant with your your certified planner like yourself, and you need those funds, and it's going to propel you to that next level. If you can kind of see where that money is taking you, the mindset on rate is actually turned, right? So I'm no longer talking about this thing called rate. I'm talking about this thing called return on an asset, or return on investment. So it's really mindset right now, and I think hopefully the rates are going to level out a little bit. I mean, the rate jumps recently were a bit of a shock to everybody, because they weren't subtle by any stretch. But nonetheless, we're still in a good position.
Yeah, I think that's important to note, in that any borrowing related to the practice, you do need to look at it in terms of return on that money, because that's essentially what it is. You're bringing in capital into the business for some investment. So what is that investment going to provide to you? And if that makes sense from the interest rate standpoint, above and beyond what you'll pay in interest, then that's what that makes sense for. So I think that's a great point to bring up, is to keep the focus on that return on investment. And that is an interesting perspective, that longer term perspective. We have been spoiled over the last 10 or so years of just historically low interest rates. And going further back, I mean, we saw this in mortgage rates too, going further back, we're still pretty close, if not just under that really, really, really long-term historical average. So, we're always so focused on the short term and what it looks like right in front of us. And that long-term perspective is important. Let's talk about that from the perspective of someone who wants to cold start their own practice from scratch. And could be someone listening that's just getting out of college and is passionate about private practice, passionate about building a business from the ground up to be in line with their vision. It could be someone who's spent a few years at a corporate setting or in another private practice, and they want to take control essentially of their own destiny. Where do they even start with the process? Because very little of them, not many of us, are going to have a few $100,000 tucked away in cash ready to fund that new endeavor. So financing is probably going to be a part of that. Where do they even start that process?
Great question. So, I mean, it starts off with a conversation. A lot of folks, go to medical school, right? And they have the idea on it just becoming a medical practitioner, right? And then once it comes to, that doctor comes out of school and they're an associate for an optometrist, they're working, and oftentimes they don't even have an idea on starting a practice because of, when I'm in a room full of folks, I'm having this conversation of let's bring out the elephant in the room, student debt.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So I have all this debt. How can I possibly open a practice? There's no way. Well, there is. And again, this goes back to working with the right lender, surrounding yourself with the right team, right? So as long as you have the right team looking over your personal wealth, right? So as long as you have the right team looking over your healthcare finance side. So where do you start? You look at, again, it goes back to the conversation of what you want to do, what your goals are. Somebody comes to me and says, hey, I want to open a practice. I want to understand what their background is, what kind of experience they have. Yes, we have options for the doctor that's like new grads, but it's not an easy task. It's not an easy task to overcome. And plus the dollar amount that I can lend is a lot lower. So, and it doesn't really often make sense because the price to build a practice from start is with inflation and everything else, price of goods has all gone up. So it doesn't even make sense to open a practice or financing a practice when you're just starting out. But if you have some experience in regards to working as an associate, right? You're working in a practice or for example, for a lens crafters or what have you, you get that experience. Try to get an understanding of the management. Try to get an understanding of how they're ordering materials, how they're scheduling, patients, as well as staff's scheduling. That's going to help us. That's going to help us partner together to get you to that next point to open that practice. Because now, aside from being a great optometrist. You're going to be now you're also going to, understand your business, right? And I'm going to ask for a business plan too. I don't need it to be a Harvard grad, MBA business plan, but I need to know how you're going to get patients, how you're going to maintain those patients, and also how you're going to, what your marketing and everything else is going to be. That's the crux of my business plan, really. And so it starts off with a conversation, really. Again, what do you want? How we're going to get there, and I help you do that. It's not like one of the things I always say is that, even post approval, right? Everybody's excited, they get approved, call it like, $400,000 to start a practice. The last thing that Wells Fargo does, or last thing a good financial firm is going to do, or maybe not do, is stroke you a check for $400,000, give you a high five, wish you luck, and walk away. They're really going to be there as a partner. And I often say that too. As far as like, it's more of a partnership. It's almost like Shark Tank, right? You walk up to the carpet, you tell me what you want, I'm going to finance you from a partnership perspective. Because the ancillary things that we offer too, it has an amazing value to our doctors, and we can get into what some of those are.
Yeah.
So one of those things, aside from the funds, right? Making sure that, again, we're talking about cold starts here. So startups,
Yep.
Right? Let's start in there. So I lend to 3 buckets, and typically you're going to borrow from 3 buckets. One of them is working capital, right? And then the second bucket is the leasehold improvements. So you find a space and it's just a shell of a space. So I'm going to give you money for, from the paint on the wall to, the partitions for your lanes. And then everything that has to do with the construction. The third bucket is equipment. So anything that you need from an equipment perspective, I'm going to lend. And then, so those ancillary things that we offer too is you're going to need to fund that. So you don't just get a $400,000 check, and you become responsible for where that money goes. What we do is I provide you a funding officer. It's almost like having a project manager, really. That's, and if you really look at that person's going to keep you on track and keep an eye out and from how much money you have to spend, and then how much money you have, where it's allocated. So you have a contractor that you need to pay. You just send us an email, you send us an invoice, or you connect us with that contractor. That funding officer is going to connect with that funding officer, get that contractor paid, or the equipment rep paid. So you don't have to, you don't have to worry about that. You can go on to do what you are supposed to be doing, is working in the practice.
Yeah.
And then the other big thing is, from a consultant perspective, so there are consultants out there that are amazing, absolutely amazing, and I could name a few. But there's some consultants out there that are amazing that will help you, not only from the business plan perspective from start to finish, because they understand the banking process as well, but they're also going to help you from a milestone perspective, right? From a marketing perspective, what you need to do for all of those things to make sure that you are bringing in those clients. But if you don't have that person, because I don't know what they cost today, but but there is a price tag on that. But if you don't have that person, Wells Fargo offers a professional management group, and there's 3 of them that support my portfolio, and collectively they have over 90 years of experience between the 3 of them. But they're phone-based consultants. So you can call that consultant from 9 to 5, make an appointment with that person. And that's all they do. They're Wells Fargo employees, and they're only employed to help our doctors through any type of challenges. They help them through what, I just mentioned, milestones. You say, by month 6 after opening your doors, I want to have X amount of patients. Either you meet that or you don't meet that. You can call them up and say, hey, help me understand why I may have not met that. And they'll go through your business plan and your business outlook and help you understand why you didn't meet that. And they work with you to get you to your goal. I actually had a doctor who acquired a practice, and I called him to check in, I say, hey doctor, how's everything going? He's like, I'm doing amazing. Everything's great. And that doctor, unfortunately, the front office person, the front office manager, there's a little bit of friction between the two. Right. So when you're buying, and we'll get into acquisitions in a minute, but with a startup, you're building that from scratch. Right. So it's a nice blank canvas, and you get to paint that canvas whatever colors you want, including your staff. When you're acquiring a practice, you're acquiring the good with the not so good sometimes.
Right.
Right. And that could be a clash of personalities with staff. That staff could have been there for 20 years. And they have this new guy or gal that's coming in, and that's going to be the business owner. And there's a little bit of shakeup, right? This is a little bit of anxiety because of all the unknowns. Well, in this case, calls me up and says, hey, David, what should I do here? I don't know, man. He's like, I'm about to retain an attorney. Do you know anybody? I was like, yeah, I know. I have a Rolodex of healthcare attorneys that I can refer you to, but why don't you check with our professional management group? Right. She's like, okay. I just kind of threw it out there. I didn't even know we went through this before. Long story short, calls a professional management group. He saves himself a couple $1,000s from a retainer perspective. He calls me back elated because the professional management group gave him some ideas on how to work with that front office gal, and now that thick as thieves. So it's the ancillary things, and making sure, again, it goes back to making sure that you're partnering with the right folks, including a finance group that only specializes in healthcare.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool resource. I have had Eric Mate of Acrinos on the podcast, and I'll throw a link into the show notes for that interview. He does help practices from idea to doors open through that whole process. I think Eye Care Advisors is another one for the listeners out there. But for those who aren't working with one of those consultants, I think that's a really cool resource for them. Let's go back to that underwriting conversation and talk about how different factors affect the whole process. And you talked about wanting to, or it's more difficult coming straight out of school versus getting a little bit more experience from an underwriting standpoint. Is that due to just simply having more experience on the resume of that doctor? Is it due to building up some sort of financial stability or a financial foundation or liquidity? What is it about that, getting those few years of experience, that helps that application?
Yeah, sounds like you went through our application process already, man. So all of those, it's a combination of all of those plus.
Okay.
Right. So your personal credit is going to be a lot of things for us. Okay. We want to make sure that, if you have any credit hiccups in the past, I want to know about those. Right. So maybe we're going to have some difficult conversations about what your previous credit history, it was and is today. I'm looking for a minimum of 665 from a personal FICO score perspective.
Okay.
But if you have a 665, I want to know why. Right. Depending on where you are, maybe, you were a late bloomer, you just got started with getting credit, or maybe you've had some credit hiccups. I just want to know why. And then I do look at liquidity. I don't have a liquidity variable, unless it's a specific dollar amount, right? I like to see about 10% of the borrowed dollar, but that's not always, everything. If there's not, you don't have that liquidity, I want to know why. I look at your experience. If you've been working for, 15 years and now you're looking to start your own practice and you only have $40 in the bank, I want to understand why, right? Where's that money going? Then I look at all your personal debt. And then, if it's a startup, we look at projections, what you're producing now and then you're going to associate to. So typically, we require the doctor to associate maybe 2 days a week, 3 days a week while they're starting that practice. And that's to help obviously pay for their personal liabilities and all of their responsibilities right now, including their rent or their mortgage, and plus our loan, right? And that personal lifestyle too. I mean, everything from, how much you're paying for, your all your monthly expenses.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So those are the things that we look at. It goes into a little bit deeper than that. Like I want to see, what's called debt service coverage. And then we'll go into acquisitions in a moment, but that's typically what we look at. I mean, in a nutshell.
Okay. So how do student loans actually affect the outcome? Is there a certain debt to income ratio that those student loans are fitting within certain guardrails? Like, how do the student loans actually impact the likelihood or the amount of debt of that application being successful? How does that fit in?
So I look at it just like any other debt.
Okay.
I look at the monthly obligation versus the balance, right? So if you're paying $400, or if you're on some type of repayment program, which 80% of folks are,
Mm-hmm.
I look at that. What's the repayment program? When is it going to come due, right? Or if you're on a deferment plan, right? Oftentimes it sounds great. You start a loan because I'm on a deferment plan. I don't have to pay anything.
Yep.
Well, I'll have to take a variable of that. So, and it's not favorable to the doctor, right? So I often ask, like, hey, go to your student loan financer and ask them if you are off the deferment plan, and if you were on some type of payment plan, what's your payment then?
Got it.
It's far lower than the variable that I use. So I take that into consideration, but it's just a monthly payment more than anything else.
Got it. Okay. And there might be scenarios where the doctors are refinancing a student loan just before getting in touch with you, or changing repayment plans in a federal loan just before getting in touch with you. Is it the current loan minimum payment that you're looking at? Is it past payments and you're seeing what that's looked like on their credit report? What's taken into account if a doctor is trying to make those changes in their student loans just before getting in touch with you?
It's the monthly obligation that I see today, right?
Okay.
It's that monthly obligation. So but if they're in the middle of refinancing that and it's going to be favorable, like if I, arbitrary number, if it's $500 today, they're going to reduce it down to $300, and it's in process. I do have to have some type of evidence that it's been approved, right? That's an exception, right? That's up to the discretion of my credit director, if we can take that. But it is whatever shows up on that credit report and whatever shows up on my personal financial statement. That's the number that I'm using.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. And everything you're saying is just, something listeners have probably heard me say a lot on different interviews that I've had, or just in conversations, is that, as much as you need to spend time thinking about the feasibility of the business and working on those projections and getting that business plan, you have to look at the feasibility from a personal finance standpoint. And you have to have a plan for your personal cash flow and covering your household expenses. And you have to build some liquidity into your life. And there's a temptation, especially if you're just coming out of school and you've got the weight of student loans, to try to pay those off as quickly as possible, and dumping every dollar you're earning into those student loans and committing to short-term, high minimum payment refinancing or different things like that. And you just have to keep, if you're thinking about cold starting a practice or buying into a practice, you've got to keep those goals in mind when making decisions like that on things like student loans or getting a mortgage or some of these other decisions you're going to do. You have to keep those other goals in mind when making those personal finance decisions. How important is the business plan from that application perspective? I've heard stories of doctors feeling like they could have gotten more lending if they had a more detailed business plan. I've heard consultants talk about how important that business plan is for a whole lot of different reasons. But from your perspective, how important is it to have a very detailed business plan in front of you?
So yeah, there was a couple of things I want to unpack in what you just said.
Sure. Yeah.
The first part of that is the temptation on going out and buying a Tesla, the temptation of going out and buying a home.
Yeah.
That's, I have too many stories. If it's 3 stories, that's too many, right? But I have too many stories where I've had a doctor who has been approved for my loan. And I always ask them, like, hey, if you're going to make any type of credit decisions that's going to involve either getting new credit or pulling your credit, please talk to me. Let's have a conversation. But sometimes that doesn't always happen. But the temptation about going out there because of a number of different reasons, of going out and getting a new car or what have you, it's going to impact my loan. I've had doctors who have been approved and the approval was about to expire. So I have to go and get it. I have to go and get it approved again, right? Or renewed, or basically an extension on the approval. It doesn't have to go through a whole underwriting process again. I don't need all of that, but we do pull credit again, right? Or we ask for an updated personal financial statement. And when I see new debt, I have to take that into consideration, right? New liquidity is fantastic, right? But new debt can be detrimental to the loan. I've had doctors who have been approved that I had to pull the approval.
Interesting. Wow.
Because they went out, and I used Tesla because that's a real life situation. And it was the model that is the plaid model. It was a little expensive. So anyways, but it was, a doctor went out and bought, a new car, and I've had other people go out and get a new home or, in investment homes and things like that. But it impacted my loan, right? And that's why I always ask to come back. Let's strategize. Let's have a conversation about that, because I can, I'll run a quick model just to see if it will work, right? And then you can pivot. You can figure out what's more important to you. I've had those conversations like, hey, David, what should I do here? I really, really want to buy a home. But I really want this practice. And then that's not up to me at that point. Mm-hmm. It's whatever's important to the doctor. But that's very, very important to keep continuing to have those conversations with your, like somebody like yourself, right? Somebody that's on their team, just to make sure that their financial plan is sound from a banking perspective, mm-hmm. and from a liquidity and personal finance perspective.
Yeah.
So that, again, that can impact that loan. And then the second part of that question was, I'm sorry, can you repeat
the business
that part?
Plan. The
business plan. Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, I don't need a Harvard business plan. It doesn't have to be extremely elaborate, and it's not going to impact how much they get. Okay. Right. But it will. It's important to know that they have a plan that is sound, right? It can't just say, hey, I'm a doctor, I'm going to be really good. And I've seen these kind of things like, trust me, I'm going to be good. And it's like, oh, that's a paragraph saying I'm going to use social media to drive business, yeah. Right? That's just part of it. Yeah. It comes down to a lot more than just that. I need a little bit more meat, and I give a template, but like if you're working with Eric Matei or Eric Bass, for example. Yep. Those Eric Bass, his plans are phenomenal. He knows what's in there. And I always recommend, don't just, build a business plan for the sake of checking a box and satisfying the bank. Keep that business plan as a roadmap to where you are and where you want to go, right? It's nothing static about it, right? And then you can kind of look at it and check off where, hey, I wanted the Taj Mahal of practices, right? And then once you realize you can get away with a lot less, start checking that box and like, oh yeah, I saved this amount of money. And then you can actually add numbers to your business plan. It becomes a working document. I've seen business plan. I've been in this business for quite some time. I've seen business plan start from, it was a nice business plan, and somebody actually used that business plan and they added numbers to it, right? They had all these variables. And when they went to go sell that practice, they were moving out of state. So they were selling that practice. It was a beautiful thing. It actually gave the buyers, right, a nice roadmap and an idea on where this practice was and where this doctor took it, and then where they can take it in the future. And it was amazing. It was pretty great. So that's my recommendation as far as don't just use it to check a box, use it as a tool for where you're going to go in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. In the conversation I had with Eric and other consultants, and that business plan informs your decisions as you're building the business. That's going to tell you what decisions to make. You're getting lending. Okay, what do you do with those funds? Well, you've decided how to allocate these resources as a part of that business plan. And it just becomes a living, breathing document as you start to build the business and then get doors open. And then you need to know how you're going to build that patient base and get the word out. So that really guides a lot of your decisions moving forward. And it isn't just a check the box sort of deal. And it's not just to get lending. Like, it is a real part of building a business. How does a spouse's finance fit into this? So imagine a doctor married, maybe the husband or wife is working. They have some liquidity. Maybe they have their own student debts. Like, how maybe a mortgage is in their name or mortgage is in the doctor's name. Like, how does a spouse's finance fit into all this?
Yeah. So it depends. Is that if the spouse is going to be on the loan, I look at the combined liabilities, what all their monthly obligations are, right, including their income. So again, it's taking the good with the bad, right? Yeah. The bad is, I use that term very loosely. It's the debt, right? I'm going to take their debt into consideration, and I'm going to take their income into consideration. Sometimes the spouse has more debt that's not associated with the borrower, right? So I don't have to take that into consideration. It's only what shows up on their, not only that personal financial statement. I want that personal financial statement from a liabilities perspective to match their credit bureau. Okay. So if they're not paying for a car note that the spouse has, and it doesn't show up on their personal credit, I don't need to know about it. Because they're not paying, then that's not their obligation. However, if they're both on that loan as co-borrowers, then it's going to show up, and I need to take that into consideration. And if the spouse isn't on my loan, however, and if they're both on the mortgage, they're both on the car notes, they're both on credit cards, I have to take all of that into consideration and only use my borrower's income.
Got it. I see.
Sometimes I'll go back and say, hey, do we have support on this? Maybe would your wife be willing to co-sponsor you on this note?
So let's imagine a doctor is associating maybe a couple days a week, but their income isn't quite enough to get them to a place where they're qualifying for the loan. They may decide, hey, maybe we can bring in the spouse in order to get the spouse's income to qualify. But if you're going to do that, you're also going to bring in any debt that the spouse has and anything else that comes along with that. Is that pretty accurate?
Yes.
Okay.
That's absolutely 100% accurate.
Okay. What do cold start loans actually look like from a payment standpoint, terms, the length of the loan? What do they actually look like from that standpoint?
Yeah, so it's a 10-year loan. It's 100% financing, meaning that I'm not going to ask you for any money down. So it's 100% financing. Typically, a loan could be, it's around $400,000, and it's broken up to the 3 buckets. It's working capital, equipment, and leasehold improvements. Rates right now, I don't have it committed to memory, but you're looking at somewhere around the mid to high 4s. And yeah, it's like I said, 2-year loan. You get your flexible from our perspective, a flexible prepayment penalty that the doctor's in complete control over. If you wanted to, you can pay it off at any time. But there is a prepayment component to it. But if you did get into a pickle, you have options to pay it down a lot sooner. We're not going to penalize you if you wanted to pay and make advance payments. Okay. We don't lock you out of the loan. And that's pretty much it.
What do the payment structures look like, or the payment structure in terms of is it principal and interest right away? Like is it immediately amortized over that 10 years? Is there is it interest only? Like what does that look like from the very beginning?
Yeah, so it's really nice. So we have a graduated payment plan, right? So a doctor's not going to get hit with a principal and interest payment right away. They're going to have some time for the build out, right? And not really making payments at that time. You can if you like, but you're not making payments at that time. And then it goes into a graduated payment plan, and it's partial interest, and then interest only, and then full interest and principal payments.
Okay.
But it's graduated over time, and typically you're not into in almost like year 2, almost year 3, your latter of year 2 that you're making a full principal and interest payment. It gives the doctor a lot of time to build up production before they have to start making a payment.
Yeah, you don't want to be using that loan money to pay back the loan money in that early year. That makes sense. And anything else you'd want to the listener to know about the cold start process from a financing standpoint? Any other myths or things to look out for in going through that application process? Anything else you'd want them to know?
Yeah, I think we touched on a lot, right? I mean, surround yourself with the right team, right? Make sure that you're in constant contact with your lender about your whatever credit you're going to either pull or get while you're in that process. And then really having a sound business plan and making sure that going back to that business plan and really leveraging the resources that the bank has during that whole process.
I think it is important too that if you are, for the listener, if you're really thinking about this and this is something that's important to you, go through the process. And even if you're feeling like you're not in a place where you can get lending for it, if that's the mindset you have, at least put all your thoughts and your vision for the business on paper. Put some numbers to it. See if it's feasible. Check out your personal finances and talk to a lender. Make sure you're certain about whether you're able to or not able to do it, instead of relying on maybe assumptions you've heard from other people or forums on Facebook or whatever it may be. Go through the process, talk to people, talk to these professionals, and at least give yourself a certain answer. Go through the process and see what's possible, instead of just writing on assumptions early on. Let's talk a little bit about practice acquisitions. You may have an associate doctor that's considering or has a plan to start to buy into the practice currently working at, or acquire it altogether. What does that process look like from the very beginning?
Yeah. So a lot of times we'll have a conversation with a doctor and they're coming up to me and they're asking about the planning of it all, like, right? Really taking, Evon's advice on like, hey, talk to Wells Fargo early, talk to David early as far as like what your visions are. Yeah. And oftentimes they say, I don't know if I want to buy a practice or I want to start a practice. And, starting a practice, starting a business, and then you never owned or started a business before, it sounds daunting, right? But it goes back to making sure you surround yourself with the right team.
Yep.
And then I'll often, after that conversation, the doctor's a lot more comfortable with the process, right? Because it starts with giving them the right tools, giving them the right resources, and helping them through their thoughts from the finance perspective on really what it looks like. So if a doctor's looking at that and like, I don't know what I want to do, oftentimes I say, okay, hey, I can't just take an application. And plus, you do not want to just take an application for the sake of taking an application, because it's a little bit of time equity on your side and my side too, right? Selfishly. Yeah. But there's the acquisition. So if they're like, I definitely know I want to do an acquisition. There's a practice that I have in mind, and I'm going to buy that practice. So again, the best practices to buy are the ones that you're working in, where the patient base, right? The staff. And so I'm looking at it from a transition perspective, right? Oftentimes too, I want to know what that transition looks like. Post-approval, once that doctor buys that practice, they're the owner of that practice. Mm-hmm. What does that transition look like? how long is that seller going to stay on the practice? So it provides a smoother transition, a smoother landing, so that the seller can show them all the nooks and crannies of that practice. But if you're working in that practice, you might already know 80% of those nooks and crannies, right? So that it helps me understand like what that transition is. I love to see a transition plan. I want to see a transition plan rather. And so the other thing, what I'm seeing nowadays, right? And I'm seeing a lot more doctors actually have these conversations with sellers. If a seller has a plan, especially the onset of COVID too, where it accelerated a lot of doctors who had a 5-year plan to retire, it accelerated that from 5 years to 2 years, right? And where a doctor is actually working in that practice, and they built it into their employment agreement that they would have first right to purchase that practice, right? And those are great. I mean, it gives an incentive to that associate at that practice to really work for that doctor, right? Really work for that seller. They're not looking elsewhere, and they're not going to jump ship for an extra $10 elsewhere, because they know in the near future this could be my practice, right? So I love those, and I have conversations with doctors like, hey, can you talk to your employer about maybe building that into your employment agreement? So those are great. And then the other ones where they just find a practice that's down the street and they're going to purchase that practice. We want to see, basically cash flow, right? And if the old saying, if it doesn't cash flow, it's a no-go, right? It's just, you want to see that as well. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier, where a doctor, the seller had a 5-year plan. COVID shrunk that plan to maybe 1 or 2 years. The doctor's like, I can't do another year with this. I'm putting it on the market. Well, it's important for the seller to prepare too, right? And again, it goes back to who the sellers has in that corner for that partners, right? That their external partners, like somebody like yourself, Evon, like, right? You're working with them from a planning perspective, right? Where's that transition of money going to go? And they're working with that tax planner too, because they may be taking a lot of expenses and taking advantage of just being a business owner, right? And they're not, they're taking advantage of like tax breaks. But it doesn't necessarily look good for me, right? Although it's obvious that they're taking advantage of those, I can't take your word on that. So it does take some planning. It does take some time before putting a practice on the market.
Okay.
Right. So that's from a cash flow perspective. And yeah, we I don't do any, like, people will say, oh, can you evaluate this practice for me? I don't do that. That's nothing I do. You have to talk to somebody who does do practice evaluations. I don't do that. The only thing that I'm really evaluating are the tax returns and the cash flow. And so sometimes I'll have a great buyer that's a very qualified buyer. And then when I marry the buyer with the seller, it's not a right fit. Sometimes that practice that they're looking to purchase is too small. And what I mean by that is that it doesn't support all their current liabilities. It doesn't support their lifestyle, right? It doesn't bring in enough income for my buyer, right? Or I have a practice that's too big for this doctor that's coming in. They don't have the wherewithal. They don't have the experience to take on this new endeavor, this new practice that they can purchase. And even though that this doctor could be qualified from a finance perspective, it's up to the banks to say, hey, look, what's the background on this doctor? Like, does he have the wherewithal to take this practice on? This is a very large producing practice. And then the other thing I look at too, what's my buyer's production compared to my seller's production? Because once that seller is gone, right, after that transition period, that production is going to be reduced, right? So if my seller is producing, X amount of dollars per month, and it's far less than my seller's, there's a problem there, right? And oftentimes I hear, oh, well, I'm going to bring in an associate. to make up the delta. Well, that's a challenge, because then that's more, and that's another expense that I have to take into consideration. And that's kind of an unknown for my buyer too, right? We don't know if that buyer, that new associate that they're going to bring in is going to stay there long term, right? So there's a number of factors aside from just the dollars that I'm looking at, right?
Yeah, that's interesting, because in a cold start, all you really have to evaluate are the doctor and the doctor's vision or business plan, right? That's kind of all you have to evaluate. But in a practice acquisition, I mean, you have so many more details to sort of sort through, and to not only make sure it makes sense from that practice's cash flow and net income, but also that buying doctor's ability to continue to produce and to create that same net income. And that is also interesting from a tax planning perspective. We are trying to shrink that net income a lot of times. From a practice selling perspective, you're wanting to increase that net income and make it look more profitable. So that's an interesting sort of balance to plan for. And just I think it just speaks to having an awareness of what your goals and plans are professionally, personally, and making sure you're working with a team to sort all that out. What are you looking at specifically in terms of the cash flow of the practice? Are you looking at the last few years of profit and loss, of tax returns? What kind of information are you gathering?
Yep. So I look at 2 years of tax returns, right? So if 2021 are on extension, I'm going to look at the P&L and balance sheet, the financials of 2021, okay, and then year to date as well. So for 2022, I want to see a P&L, balance sheet, and production report for that matter. And then, the most recent tax returns.
Okay. And do you have any thoughts or have you seen examples of what a good transition plan looks like from all of the transitions you've seen? I mean, what are your thoughts in general just about how to make sure that there is a good transition or a solid transition in place?
Yeah, the transition that the most successful ones, like I said, are the ones where the buyer's already working in that practice.
Okay.
If they're not, the other thing too, the seller, having the seller be part of having some interest, aside from just like, hey, I got my money, I'm going to Barbados, I want to, that doctor, that seller that's going to be in that practice, because that transition period, it's typically, it could be 6 months, a year, and they're getting, it's some type of agreement that between buyer and seller, either it's going to be a consultant agreement or off of whatever they produce for that month or what have you. But the best transition plans that I've seen are ones that the seller stays on for an amount of time, and not just like from a phone-based perspective, like, oh, I'm here if you need me. They're actually working in that practice, because you want to, if the buyer coming in doesn't know the staff, doesn't know the patient base, if the seller is there and they can kind of ease them into it, those are the best ones.
Anything in particular that you've seen that a buyer should keep in mind when looking at wanting to buy a practice? Anything from their perspective that they should keep in mind?
Yeah, and it goes back to my Shark Tank analogy, right? Like, it's like, if you go up to, we want to make sure I'm in a partnership with you, because that doctor's success is my success, right? And my name's on that practice, Wells Fargo's name's on that practice, if it doesn't do so well. So we're always making sure that practice, cash flows, and it does have, and it's not just cash flowing in 1 year and then potentially cash flowing in another year. We don't want to see that, right? We want to see consistency or improvements. And some of the things that I often I see sometimes are fire sales. Those are ones that, maybe a doctor got in over their head, and a seller, and they started, they have 2 practices and they're starting another, and they come to realize they just don't have the time to manage the other practice, right? So they're selling it. It's a fire sale. They just need to offload it and sell it fast. It's not too many patients. or like, a doctor's kind of running away from a problem. I'll never know that, but from a finance perspective, I'll look at look at the trends and the practice has been around for a lot of years and it just hasn't grown. So what's the reason for that? And one thing that and this is what we do for startups as well. It's really important. I forgot to mention this, and it's a very big part of our decision is demographics. So because a practice could be around for 20 years and there's no growth because of the demographics are challenging. I actually help my doctors, my startups, with a demographic report. And it's an extremely robust demographic report, right? It's going to tell me, it's going to tell us what the competition looks like for the most part, right? So a practice that's on a fire sale and the practice has been around for 20 years, it might just be in a location that doesn't have the ability to grow. There's not potential patients to bring into that practice. And then on top of that, it's saturated with competition, right? So that's the one thing to look out for too. It might look like it's a good deal and you can get this practice for cheap and you have the wherewithal to bring in the marketing and everything. But the seller might have already tried all those tricks. It didn't work only because of the demographics. And it was just in a saturated area that just didn't, that wouldn't allow growth for that practice. So those are the kind of things that I look out for. And I help my doctors try to understand like, hey, I'm not telling you no, but again, it's for, because I want to tell you no, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but we want to take a step back and understand why this practice is selling for, it's producing X amount of dollars, but, they're putting it on sale. Why are they selling it for so cheap? I ask the doctors all the time. Like, I'm just getting a good deal. Yeah. I'm just getting a good deal. I hear it all the time. Like, well, there's got to be a reason. And none of us are in this for nonprofit for that matter.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, think about just valuations. What goes into the valuation of a business? It's the expectation or certainty or uncertainty of future cash flows. And if the value of the practice is lower than expected, well, then that tells you something about future cash flow. There's either a lot of uncertainty or a lot less of it than you're expecting. What about when there's real estate involved in the practice? It's my understanding that these are sort of two separate transactions. Like, how does that work when there's real estate involved? Practice owned or practice real estate owned by the seller?
Yeah, I love those naturally, right? Because I always talk to my doctors, if you can find a practice that's a cash flowing practice and then you have the opportunity to buy real estate, that's great for a couple different reasons. The number one reason is because of the asset, right? I can't put a practice on the market and have my audience to buy that practice is extremely small, right? I'm looking for another optometrist, another physician to buy that practice, qualified physician. But if I put a commercial real estate building on the market for sale, that opens up a lot more options to sell, right? And then oftentimes your lease compared to your mortgage is it could be the same or less if you own that building. So those are great. And plus, if you have a lease, right? If you have a lease, that landlord potentially could dictate what your future looks like, right? You're going to sign a 10-year lease, 5-year lease with options. But after that, I mean, that's, what happens to that building is up to that landlord for the most part. So yeah, we look at it like two different transactions. We're going to look at the acquisition as one transaction. That could be a 10-year note, right? And that's 100% financing for that acquisition of that practice. Then we're going to look at the real estate as another note, right? You want to keep those separate and talk to your CPA and your attorney for those, but for a lot of different reasons, that's going to benefit you, and to protect yourself, you're going to want to keep those separate, have it under a different LLC, a different entity as well. But the real estate, I can do a 25-year term on that. I have SBA options, and I also have conventional options, right? So, and the financing, again, is a bit different. On the commercial real estate side, I'm looking for 3 years of financials for the most part.
Okay. Yeah, and what are you seeing in terms of timing? I can imagine for tax purposes, capital gains purposes, you might want to separate out the timing from the seller's perspective of selling the practice versus selling the real estate as an asset. Are you typically seeing those sold together within the same year? Are you seeing those separated out? What are you usually seeing from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a combination. It all depends on the seller. Like sometimes, and again, this is one of the benefits of owning a real estate with the practice is that you can have even thinking in the future, right? When you kind of although you might be it's your first practice that you're purchasing, you're not really thinking that far ahead. But you oftentimes you can keep the real estate and become a landlord, get paid after post sale of the practice. That's a number of years later. But I see a combination of the two. I mean, I see some practices that are selling with real estate. It makes it more attractive on the market, and they sell really fast at a premium, more so than just a practice.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else that, let's say, a buyer should keep in mind if they are looking to acquire? Anything where you typically see doctors getting tripped up in the process, or anything they should watch out for going through that process?
Yeah. The other thing that I would say is, if you have a practice that you're going to acquire, and there's an associate there, that an associate's been there for the last 10 years, or even 3-4 years for that matter. Why isn't that associate buying that practice? Right? Do they know something that you don't know? Or if that associate is a big producer, right? What's going to happen if that associate leaves? What's going to happen to the cash flow of that practice? Right. So you got to think through all of those things, and really taking consideration of the staff, taking consideration of some of the agreements that they have with different vendors. So you want to make sure that you can either buy into some of those or take over those contracts, or have similar contracts, right? And then again, it's that transition period, right? Because typically there's the statistic is that it is about a 5 to 10% attrition post acquisition, where where you'll lose out on patients patients go elsewhere, right? Because they've been used to that doctor for many years. The doctor leaves, it gives them the opportunity to look elsewhere. So you kind of think through those things. I don't take that, I have conversations about that with my doctors, but it's not a variable that I include into. I don't say, hey, I'm going to reduce this 10%, as a buffer, but it's something you really want to think about. What happens if I lose 5 to 10% of my patient base?
Yeah, I just hearing everything you're saying. I mean, there's so much to sort through, especially from the acquisition side. I think it just makes sense. What you've been saying all along is just keep in touch with your professionals. Get your team on your side. Talk with your different professionals from a financial planning standpoint, lending standpoint, tax, legal. Just get everyone on the same page, and making sure that you're looking through all this information, and you're making the decision that's best for you. Anything else you'd want to leave with the listeners, kind of as we wrap up here, about anything from a practice lending standpoint? Anything else on your mind?
Yeah, I want to really touch on that demographics report again. I mean, I really, that's more part of the startup conversation, really, right? That demographics report, it's not stale data, and we're looking at that from a partnership perspective. We want to make sure that the practice that you're looking to go into is going to have potential success. And what we found was a good demographics report. This demographic, you can go and get a demographics report for $100. I actually pay for that demographics report. And if a consumer were to go out and get that demographics report on their own, it's $1,700. We partner with a group called EOS, and they do that demographics report for us. And it's, I wouldn't say free to our doctors. It's because it's, but we want to make, because it's, although I pay for it, it comes out of our budget, my budget.
Got it.
But again, we provide it to our doctors. And we look at the surrounding zip codes. We look at, everything from psychological barriers. It's very, very, very important to understand where you're going into, from a competition perspective.
Got it. That's awesome. And where can people find you, follow you, learn more about the resources you provide practice owners or soon-to-be practice owners?
Yep. I have one phone number by design. Sometimes I'm glutton for punishment, but you can always call me, text me, David Tessier, again, and my phone number is 619-997-6883, or you can always email me at d.tessier@wellsfargo.com. And we have a Wells Fargo healthcare website where there's a lot of information. You can find my contact there as well.
Got it. Well, this has been awesome. Appreciate your time today, David, and all the great, awesome information you provided. A lot to think about, a lot to sort through. And I will put everything you mentioned in the show notes. So we'll make sure all of your contact information and everything you talked about will be in the show notes as well. But for the listener, appreciate your time and being with us today. And we'll catch you on the next episode. In the meantime, take care.
Want more resources to help master your money? Check out the Education Hub on Evon's website at optometrywealth.com. Evon Mendrin is a certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, a California registered investment advisor. All opinions of Evon and his guests are their own. This show is for informational purposes only and should not be relied on for specific investment, legal, tax, or other decisions. Clients of OWA may own securities mentioned on this show.